All right, we're going to get underway here, guys, because we have a lot of ground to cover and 75 minutes to do this entire chapter on personality. So we have test number 3 on Tuesday morning. We start at 9:30. If you show up more than 25 minutes late, that is past 9:55, then you won't get a test, you'll get a 0. So please make sure that you're there on time on Tuesday. That's really, really important. Okay. Here's the lay of the land for today's session on personality. We're going to begin by defining personality, kind of getting us all on the same page, if you will. Then we will, for the third time in this part 3 of our course, visit the nature versus nurture issue. So we're going to, this time, look at it with respect to personality. So are you outgoing and talkative in the life of the party, or are you quiet and shy and reserved? And is that driven by genetics or environment? What's the deal there? Like we did with intelligence and like we did with language development, we'll take a look at nature versus nurture. We'll spend about 15 or 20 minutes talking about ways of assessing personality. So how do we go about measuring and trying to quantify this thing that we call personality? And then our major thrust for probably the final 45 minutes or so this morning will be on the different theories of personality. So we're going to take a look at 4 different major theories and lay out their central ideas so that by the time we're done doing that, we'll be able to compare and contrast those different theories with each other. So that's where we're headed today. Are there any housekeeping questions on anything that you guys want me to clarify for you as we get started this morning? Slava, who's one of our TAs, helped me out last night by entering the extra credit points. So in the Blackboard grades now, you should see 7 points if you completed 2 hours or more of research participation by that mid-semester deadline. If there are any problems with that, probably the best thing to do is to email Slava, because he's the one who's got the Excel spreadsheet with the list of names. And basically all he did was he took the list from the research participation people who sent that to him and translated that over into 7 points in that column in the gradebook in Blackboard. All right, so let's begin by defining personality and get us all on the same page this morning. So this definition up top will work. Personality refers to the characteristics, emotional responses, thoughts, and behaviors that are relatively stable over time and across circumstances. So I would say the key word here is about stability, and that stability is not only temporal, that is, it's consistent and stable over time. So when you were 5 and when you're 15 and when you're 25, you were shy and quiet and reserved all the way through. It's also consistent across circumstances. Okay? Now, at age 25, whether you're at work or you're hanging out with some friends or you're doing something in your free time on the weekend, you tend to be kind of quiet and shy and reserved. So we see both temporal stability as well as situational stability with respect to this thing that we call personality. And usually the best way to think about personality is to think about specific personality traits like extroversion or introversion. Those are 2 ends of one continuum, right? If you're extroverted, you're outgoing and talkative in the life of the party. If you're introverted, you're quiet and shy and reserved. Well, these personality traits are enduring qualities or enduring attributes that you have that influence your behavior across situations. I think the key phrase down here is the personality traits, which are unobservable, are made observable because what they do is they influence your observable behavior. So here's the deal. We can't directly get at the personality trait of introversion, let's say, right? I can't directly observe that in an MRI or a PET scan. But what I can do is I can infer that you're either high or low on that introversion personality trait by the things that you do, right? So the idea with this is the observable behaviors are what help us to be able to infer the existence of these unobservable personality traits. Does that make sense? Right? Can't directly get at this personality trait, but I can sort of bootstrap my way to that point by looking at how it affects your behavior. And so if I observe or ask you about behavior, what I observe, the responses you give me, will tell me something about how you fall with respect to that personality trait. Okay? So this is what we're trying to get at, right? What type of a person are you? And how does that manifest itself in terms of these personality traits that, again, are both stable over time and across different situations? Okay? That's the first of our topics of the day, and that was easy to take care of, getting us all on the same page here in terms of that definition. Now we want to talk about how we approach the nature versus nurture issue. Well, it turns out we use the same tools for disentangling nature and nurture effects for personality that we use for disentangling those effects with respect to intelligence. We're going to look at results from twin studies and adoption studies. And I'm going to summarize that by saying the evidence that is available from those twin studies and adoption studies strongly suggests that these various personality traits have a genetic component. Okay, so these kinds of studies here we've already talked about, right? MZ twins and DZ twins, and looking at child versus adopted mom and child versus biological mom. Well, the data we have depicted for you over here on the right side in this little graph from different textbooks looks at monozygotic twins who share, again, 100% of their genes, nice review here, versus dizygotic twins who we know share 50% of their genes, okay? And what we're looking at here, what we're quantifying, is their degree of similarity on different dimensions of personality. So it's a correlation between twin pairs on personality traits including neuroticism, extroversion, openness to experience, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. What do you notice about the bar charts here? Tell me in your own words in the chat box. What's obviously going on here with the data? Which bars are always bigger than which bars? Anybody? Thank you. Yeah, the monozygotic twin correlations are always bigger or stronger than are the dizygotic twin correlations. Okay? When that goes on, we know that whatever the trait is that we're talking about, it looks like it's influenced by genetic factors, right? The more similar you are genetically to someone, the more similar you are to that person with respect to these different personality traits. Now, is personality totally genetically driven? No. How do we know it's not totally genetically driven? What would these correlation coefficients be for the MZ twins if personality were entirely genetically driven? Yeah, that would be positive 1.0. So the way that we think about this is we think that genes may be predisposing us, that is, giving us a tendency towards having certain personality traits that are, again, associated with behavioral tendencies. So this really goes back to what we had on the previous slide, that we are inferring the existence of the underlying personality traits by seeing what you're doing behaviorally. Again, the behavior that we observe tells us something about the unobservable personality traits. Okay? That's what we've got going on here from this research. The final piece that I want to drop in here is the fact that temperament may be an early glimpse at the underlying personality. Okay, so I'm going to just make that explicit here. May be an early glimpse at personality. What do I mean by that? Well, temperament is something we referred to and discussed briefly in the recording on development that you guys are supposed to have viewed by now. It's a general tendency to feel or act in certain ways, observable from the time you're an infant. And we see it in a couple of different dimensions. We see it in terms of your activity level, your emotionality, how fussy and irritable, and how much do you cry, etc., and your degree of sociability. And the suggestion here is that this temperament might be an early glimpse of personality that is driven by some of these kinds of genetic factors, right? That the biological piece is in place right from the get-go. And we see early on, for example, in terms of your sociability, right? How are you when you interact with new people, and new people come to your house, etc., right? That might give us an insight into, for example, how extroverted you might be later on in your life, right? So again, this idea of early temperament being a glimpse at, or an early window into the degree to which you might have some of these other personality traits later on in life. Okay? So take-home message is clearly that there's a genetic component. It's not a genetic dictate to personality, right? So it makes you more likely, the genetics do, to maybe have certain kinds of personality traits, but then environment acts on that, right? So what your family is like, your mom and dad and brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles and cousins, your friends at school, the kids on the different teams or activities you're involved with growing up, that's where environment, things like observational learning, can act upon this genetic component. And maybe you learn to be, for example, conscientious, right, which means thoughtful and considerate and reliable and dependable, and you show up for things on time and you turn things in on time because that's what you observe repeatedly within your family, let's say. Okay? So that's the story in terms of the nature versus nurture story with respect to personality. Any questions on that at all? Yep, I can do that for you. Give me 1 second, guys. And then I know I've got to press this other button. Did I do that? You got it. Okay. And I know on my end I got to do one more thing here and then push that down. Perfect. Okay. So that takes care of the second of the things on our to-do list for today as we're trying to blast through this section on personality. Okay, nature versus nurture. Any questions on either the definition of personality or the nature versus nurture issue here? Awesome. Time to talk about personality assessment here. I want you to walk away this morning understanding the major differences between objective approaches to personality assessment and projective approaches to personality assessment, because there are pretty big differences that you need to be aware of. So with objective testing, what we do is we get self-reports from people about their personality, okay? For example, there's a very famous objective personality test known as the MMPI-2. What does that stand for? Well, I'll spell it out for you here. The MMPI-2 stands for the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. Okay, believe it or not, the MMPI-2, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, is comprised of 567 true-false items to which we ask you to respond. It's a self-report. So it has statements like, I enjoy outdoor activities. It has statements like, sometimes I like to be by myself. It has statements like, sometimes other people annoy me, right? And for each of these items, you say true or false. Okay, we're asking you to tell us about yourself in a direct, objective way. Okay, now obviously what we're susceptible to there, because it's a self-report, is people potentially lying and misrepresenting their personality. We'll get to that and how to address that in just a bit. Okay, but here are some of the kinds of statements that will be part of the MMPI. Okay, you don't need to memorize these different MMPI scales over here. I just want you to see some of the kinds of items that might show up. So on the depression scale would be items like this one, where it says, I often feel that life is not worth the trouble. Okay, if you're going to score high on that depression scale, do you think you're going to say true or false to that item? It's one of 567 true-false items. If you're going to score high on depression, what's going to happen? You're probably going to say true. Okay. If you're going to score high on the paranoia scale, you're probably going to say high to the. You're probably going to say high. You're probably going to say true to the item that says several people are following me everywhere. Similarly, for schizophrenia, you would say true to the item, I seem to hear things that other people cannot hear, and so forth. Again, you don't need to memorize these different scales. What ultimately happens is the MMPI-2 program, thank God this is computerized now, right, will yield an output that gives you a profile for this objective test across these 10 different scales. Hypochondriasis all the way through social introversion. Again, way more than you need to know here. But basically what we can see here is the person who did this profile scored pretty high on depression and also scored relatively high on something called psychasthenia, which is basically like an OCD type scale. And they actually on this slide are showing you what happens to their scores before treatment in blue and after treatment in orange here. So after treatment, we were able to reduce those scores on the depression scale. We were able to reduce those scores on the psychasthenia scale. Again, more detail than you need to know. Your take-home message for the MMPI-2 is basically that it's an objective approach to personality assessment where we ask you to self-report by responding to 567 true-false items. The other thing I want you to remember as well is that this kind of approach, these objective tests, generally speaking, have both good reliability and good validity. What does that mean? That means that they yield consistent results and that the measure measures what we say it measures. So this is a good review of reliability and validity, which we've now talked about not only back in the method section, back in January or early February, but now twice in part 3 of our course. Not only when we talked about intelligence, but now when we're talking about personality. So it yields consistent results, and it measures what it says it's going to measure. Now, I mentioned before, there are problems potentially to which you are exposed when you rely on self-report measures, right? People could lie, right? They could say that they're feeling really, really paranoid over here by saying, true to this item, several people are following me everywhere. The good news is the MMPI-2 has validity scales built in, basically truth detecting scales, that will catch you either saying that you have problems that you don't have or denying that you have problems that you do have. Okay? I don't want to get into all the details of how that works, but basically the take-home message is there's a way to detect if you're not being truthful in responding to this objective test. Okay? And if we determine or detect that you're not being truthful, the computer won't even generate the profile that we were looking at here. It will just say this person was not responding truthfully to this measure. You shouldn't evaluate the results. You should ask them to redo it. Okay, so that's the objective approach. Okay, a very different approach to personality assessment is embodied in the projective testing approach. The projective testing approach is based on something known as the projective hypothesis. Okay? The projective hypothesis is a Freudian notion which basically says if I were to expose you to any of a variety of different ambiguous stimuli, what will happen is you will project onto those ambiguous stimuli various aspects of your personality. So what kinds of ambiguous stimuli might I expose you to? Well, I might expose you to ink blots. I might expose you to unclear pictures. I might expose you to incomplete sentences. And in response to those stimuli, what you will do is you will project onto them, right? Like a film projector projects onto the screen. You will project onto these ambiguous stimuli various different things about yourself. Okay, some of the more famous projective tests are the Rorschach. The Rorschach is the one that uses the ink blots. There's another one called the TAT, which stands for the Thematic Apperception Test. It's the one that uses unclear pictures, and I'll show you examples of each of those in just a bit. Okay? So let's take a look at some items from something like the Rorschach. The Rorschach ink blot test involves presenting you with an ink blot and then saying to you, what might this be? So I'm going to give you like 10 of these cards and say to you, what might this be? So in the chat box, tell me, what do you see when you look at this ink blot? It's just ink thrown on a page, folded in half, and unfolded. Lots of people say they see a clown. All right? Shannon says she sees a rabbit. What might this be? I'm just going to be standard in my administration, keep saying, what might this be? Gabriel sees grandmother. Okay? Kinsey sees a panda. If you look at parts instead of the entire ink blot, if you looked in the middle here, what might this be? You might say, oh, that looks like a butterfly, or it looks like an angel, right? If you look at these yellow figures up top, you might say, oh, it looks like Peeps from Easter. Somebody sees something that looks like a lip. You might say, this looks like two people who are touching hands here in the middle. All these are different responses you might give. Here's another example of an ink blot. I might give you this one. And a person might say, it looks like two people. They're fighting over something, so it almost looks like a tug of war. They're pulling on this item. Or maybe they're carrying something heavy together, so they're cooperating rather than fighting. Maybe it's a person looking in the mirror. You get that mirror response a lot because there's symmetry to these slides. Again, the ink is thrown on the page, it's folded in half, and makes it symmetrical then. See a butterfly. Where's the butterfly? Right in the middle here, maybe a red butterfly. Okay? That's how you administer this projective test, this Rorschach. Then what happens is you are tasked as the person giving this test with interpreting those responses. And here's where the problems come in. Because the Rorschach in particular and projective tests in general have problems with both reliability and validity. And specifically in terms of reliability, they have problems with what we refer to as inter-rater reliability. That is, if I were to give your responses to 10 of these ink blots to 3 different psychologists or psychiatrists, I could get very, very different interpretations across those 3 different mental health professions. So that's a big problem, right? We want consistency. That's what reliability is about, whether it's temporal consistency, you take it today and you take it again in a month and you get similar results, or it's this inter-rater reliability. There are problems with that, and there are problems with validity, right? Remember, validity is truthfulness. How well does my measure measure what I say it measures? It's supposed to be measuring personality. Well, depending on the responses, maybe we're also picking up things like creativity or something about your verbal facility, your vocabulary skills, and being able to describe different things. It's supposed to be about personality, but we might inadvertently be picking up some of these other things. Let me show you the TAT as another example. Okay, so here's the Thematic Apperception Test. I give you a handful of cards like this where I've got these unclear pictures. And unclear, I don't mean they're out of focus. I mean it's not exactly clear what's going on in the picture. And with the TAT, what happens is I present you with these cards and I say to you, for each of the cards, I want you to tell me a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I want you to tell me what the people in the story are thinking and feeling. Right? So this one here, it's a child who's looking at a violin. Okay, tell me a story about what's going on in that card. Okay. Again, big problems here with the TAT with respect to reliability and validity, but it is hinging on trying to get back to my slide here. It is hinging on this projective hypothesis, right? If I give these unclear pictures, you are going to project onto them things about yourself. So if all of your stories have people feeling isolated, alone, lonely, and depressed, maybe that's something that might be going on for you in terms of your personality. Again, concerns about reliability, how do I interpret these different stories, and questions about validity. Am I really measuring personality, or might I inadvertently be measuring something else? All right? Let me stop there for a second. Any questions about objective testing versus projective testing? You need to understand what each of them is in and of itself, and then you need to be able to compare and contrast them and see how they differ from each other. Questions at all on that? You guys feel pretty good about that? All right, I'm going to take that as a yes because there's deafening silence. All right, so we can check off the third item on our to-do list, which leaves us a good 50 minutes to do the fourth and final one, and that's good because this is where the heavy lifting is for today. We're going to review now 4 major theories of personality, beginning with Freud's psychodynamic theory of personality and running through these other ones listed on the slide here for you. So psychodynamic theory is going to be based off of the work of Sigmund Freud. Humanistic theory is going to involve the work of Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. We'll see those guys in a little while. Cognitive social learning theory. Social learning theory part should remind you of our old friend Albert Bandura. He was the Bobo doll experiment guy, the observational learning guy. And then finally, in the last 10 minutes or so, we'll get into Raymond Cattell's 5-factor model of personality. Sometimes you'll see this called the Big Five, not the Big Give, the Big Five model of personality. Okay, so we're going to begin with Freud, and what you're going to notice is we're going to spend a lot more time on psychodynamic theory than on anything else, and that's not because Freud's theory is better or whatever. It's because Freud's theory is probably the most complicated, it's probably the most comprehensive, and it's also the theory to which some of these other theories are reactions. So if you know a lot about Freud's theory on the front end, when we get into humanistic theory and the work of Maslow and Rogers, why they emphasize what they emphasize will make sense, because a lot of what they came up with was in reaction to Freud's theories and sort of reactions to the criticisms of Freud's theory. So if you make sense of Freud, when it comes to these other theories, it makes sense why they talk about what they talk about. And that will become clear as we run through this. So let's begin with Freud's psychodynamic theory of personality, some of which we've talked about in passing along the way. I just want to sort of gather everybody up over these next couple slides so that we're all pretty much on the same slide, on the same page. So psychodynamic theory of personality we know is associated with Sigmund Freud, and his belief basically is that personality, which after all is our focus today, right, is rooted in unconscious conflicts between our desires and our actual experiences. So the key word here is unconscious, right? Any test question that is focused on Freud's model is probably going to have the word unconscious in it. Or said another way, if there's an item that says something about the unconscious, the correct answer is going to be Freud or psychodynamic theory. So personality is rooted in unconscious conflicts between what? Between what we want and what's actually happening on a daily basis. So his model would suggest that personality is driven by discrepancies, right, between our desires. For example, maybe we desire to be recognized and praised for our work, and those desires are not being met on an everyday basis. Right? Or maybe we have some kind of sexual or aggressive impulses that are not being acted on an everyday basis. Okay? So Freud would say things like anxiety or depression or other kinds of things going on with our functioning might be a product of these unconscious conflicts, right? Things that we're not necessarily aware of. Okay? Freud's model, as it says down below here, also includes the notion of psychic determinism. If I were to summarize psychic determinism for you, I'd say it means basically that nothing happens by chance. And I'm not referring to nothing in the world overall happens by chance, but with respect to your behavior and your thinking and your emotions, this model would suggest that none of the stuff that goes on there is happening by chance. In other words, if you were to dig around and play detective thoroughly enough, what would happen is you would be able to uncover the reasons why you're doing what you're doing, thinking what you're thinking, or feeling what you're feeling. Okay? It's related to the notion, psychic determinism is, related to the notion of a Freudian slip. Okay, have you guys ever heard of a Freudian slip? A Freudian slip is when we say something, and maybe it's not necessarily exactly what we wanted to say or how we wanted to say it. We might do something like this, depicted on the next slide. The queen comes in, she speaks to the king, and she says, "Good morning, beheaded, I mean beloved." Okay? She has a Freudian slip here where she says beheaded, when maybe she really, in a socially acceptable way, would want to say beloved instead. Okay? So the beheaded piece, according to Freud, doesn't come from nowhere, right? This goes back to the previous slide of nothing happens by chance. So the fact that she says beheaded, tell me in the chat box, what might that mean in terms of her feelings about this guy? Yeah, she wants him dead. Right? I got it. I know it wasn't she wants him dead. Yeah. She wants him dead. Although that was ironically a Freudian slip with a mistyping in the chat box. Okay? Other Freudian slips. You might go to a party with a friend of yours and say, instead of "this is the best party ever," you might say, this is the best party ever. Right? Something like that would be another Freudian slip. Again, nothing happens by chance. That's what psychic determinism is all about. If we dig around long enough, we can find the underlying reason why you're doing or saying or thinking or feeling whatever you're doing or saying or thinking or feeling. All right? Questions on those introductory ideas there from Freud and his psychodynamic theory? Good. You guys seem like you're on top of it today. Well, one of the things that we know about Freud's model is that its emphasis is definitely on the unconscious forces. Look at the bottom and the base of the iceberg here, right? Most of the action, according to his model, occurs down here in the unconscious. Activity that's going on well below our level of conscious awareness. In fact, if you look at the tip of the iceberg, which is where Freud in this slide would be depicting conscious behavior, that conscious level of awareness, everything you're aware of at the moment, is literally on this slide just the tip of the iceberg. Okay? If you really want to discover what's making a person tick, what's driving their personality, since that's our focus today, Freud would say you need to dig around down here under the waterline in the base of this iceberg. You need to be looking at things like id and superego. And we're going to be talking about these three parts of personality in just a second. Okay, so the message on this slide basically is that conscious behavior is really not telling us the whole story, right? If we want to get at the whole story and uncover why people are the way they are in terms of personality, we need to dig around in the unconscious. We maybe need to go back to things from their early childhood and see what kind of hang-ups are present there from what was going on early in life like that. Okay? So let's talk about id, ego, and superego. These are the three structures in personality according to Freud's model. So we've got id, ego, and superego. Let's lay out what each of these is all about. The id is what houses our basic biological urges. It's the most primitive part of personality, and it basically consists of all of our basic biological urges. So things like hunger and thirst and sex drive and all of that stuff, right? Those basic biological urges. And the id abides by the pleasure principle. What's the pleasure principle? Well, it's an old Janet Jackson album, but that's not what it means here. The pleasure principle is an approach to living that says, I want satisfaction now, regardless of any consequences or costs. Okay? So if the id were in charge, it would just let you act on and satisfy any urge or any impulse that you might have. Okay? If you have a sexual impulse, the id would say, act on it. If you have an aggressive or violent impulse, it would say, satisfy that aggressive or violent impulse, and don't worry about whether you may get locked up for doing so. So, if the world were driven just by id, what would the world look like? What kind of world would we be living in if it was all driven by id? It would be very, very chaotic, right? Lots of sex and aggression and immediate satisfying of impulses and consequences be damned, is basically what would happen. Thankfully, we have a counterbalance to those impulses of the id, and those counterbalances are housed in the superego. The superego represents the internalized rules of our parents, and through our parents, the internalized rules of society, right? I usually think about the superego as consisting of our conscience. You have to spell this right because we're talking about conscious and unconscious behavior. The conscience, our sense of right and wrong, is housed within the superego, right? The superego basically consists of what I would call primitive do's and don'ts about living our lives, right? Thou shalt not, well, fill in the blank, whatever the rules are for you, right? Thou shalt not hit a boss in the head with a brick. The id says if you're pissed off at your boss, hit her in the head with a brick. Superego says, thou shalt not hit thy boss in the head with a brick. Okay, so almost inevitably we're going to have tension and conflict between id and superego, right? Id wants to just do whatever it wants to do and doesn't care about the consequences, right? Superego sits there with its hands folded and says, thou shalt not do that, or that other thing, or that other thing. So we need a mediator, and that's really the role that the ego is going to play here. I like to think about the ego as the mediator that is focused on pragmatism. In terms of pragmatism, what we're getting at here is the ego is obeying the reality principle. And the pragmatism comes in here in terms of how can I pragmatically meet the id's impulses. So this is about the pragmatic meeting of id's impulses based on the real world is what I'm trying to type, and its real demands. Okay? How can I satisfy an aggressive or violent or sexual impulse housed in the id without violating all the rules down here in the superego? Right? Thou shalt not A, B, C, D, E, F. Okay, here's what the ego might do as a mediator to pragmatically meet those id impulses. If you want to hit your boss in the head with a brick, so says the id, and the superego says, thou shalt not hit thy boss in the head with a brick, what might the ego work out? Well, the ego might work out something like this, where you get back at your boss indirectly. Maybe you show up late, or you take longer than necessary to complete some kind of task or project. That's where the ego might go with this. You see that? It's sort of a middle ground here where the id is satisfied that, like, you're sticking it to the boss, and the superego is satisfied because you're not violating lots of these prohibitions that are housed within your conscience. Does everybody see how that sort of makes the ego play this role of mediator? Can't we all get along is basically what the ego is trying to accomplish here. Let me stop there for a second. Questions about these three parts of personality? Ego tells you to do whatever the id wants to do without breaking the superego's rule. Yeah, how can I finesse this? Right? The way that I think about this is what the ego is trying to do, Gabriel, is finesse it so that the id feels like, oh, thank God I was able to get back at the boss. and the superego says, thank God we didn't violate any of these rules and do anything wrong. Does that make sense? Perfect. Good. You would think after doing this for 16 years I would figure this out. I think you helped me figure it out even more with that question. Good. Let me ask you this, guys. If you had id, ego, and superego coming to SDSU together, and they were put together in a triple, in a dorm, how well are they going to get along with each other? Probably all those things, Jacob. Yeah. Family and societal rules, probably more than some kind of natural law. The model here is that family is the mechanism through which societal rules get transmitted to you. So tell me, guys, id, ego, superego, sitting around singing Kumbaya all together, getting along just fine, or what's going to happen? They're not going to get along very well. There's going to be conflict between and among id, ego, and superego. And what I want you guys to understand is this conflict is going to drive anxiety. Okay, we're going to feel the tension, and it's going to make our anxiety go up. And what we're going to do to try to relieve or alleviate that tension is we're going to turn to things like repression or other defense mechanisms. So this is going to be defense mechanism number 1 here. It is the most basic of the defense mechanisms, that of repression. When we repress something, what do we do with it? Basically, we just try not to think about it, right? I usually think about this as the bury it defense mechanism. Just don't think about it, okay? Bury these things, push them out of conscious awareness. What's the goal here? Again, the goal with the repression or other defense mechanisms is to reduce anxiety, right? I want to feel less anxious. Well, one way to feel less anxious about your aggressive or violent impulses that you feel towards your mom or dad or towards your boss or whatever the case might be is just don't think about those things, okay? Don't think about it, and you'll feel better, right? You'll feel less anxious if you bury it and don't think about it. So that's the first and actually the most primitive of the defense mechanisms. We've got 4 others that we're going to talk about over here on the right side of the slide. We're going to talk about displacement, reaction formation, rationalization, projection, all of which are strategies that we use to avoid the anxiety that's caused by conflicts between and among id, ego, and superego. Again, the goal here is to make us feel better, to relieve the tension, to relieve the anxiety. Now, we may not be consciously aware of the fact that we're using these things, but all of them are, again, aimed at reducing anxiety. So in operant conditioning terms, if we were to try to sneak a little bit of behaviorism in here in talking about Freud's model, what's going on? When we use repression or any of these other defense mechanisms, if they help us reduce anxiety, what form of reinforcement is that? When we get rid of something that we don't like. There's your negative reinforcement again. So if, as a behaviorist here, I try to sneak in some behaviorism in our discussion about psychodynamic theory, and this is where I'd do it, okay? So again, the first defense mechanism, it's really primitive and basic. Just don't think about it. Just bury it. The second one we're going to talk about, and then numbers 3, 4, and 5 are right here. Displacement, reaction formation, rationalization, and projection. So what is displacement? I refer to displacement as the drag and drop defense mechanism. What does drag and drop mean? Well, like on your computer, right? Drag it from one place and drop it somewhere else. In this case, desires or impulses that can't be fulfilled in one context might get displaced onto another, okay? So we might have that feeling of stress and pressure and conflict and all that negativity from work and feel aggressive impulses. We don't act on those aggressive impulses at work. We don't hit the boss in the head with a brick. But when we come home, we're mean to our spouse, or we're mean to the kids, or we have a short fuse, or we come home and kick the dog, right? That would be displacement, where you're dragging and dropping something going on in one context where you don't act on it onto another context. That make sense? Okay, and you may even be able to think of your own examples where maybe you've done this, right? You're upset about something over there, and because you sort of kept yourself from acting on that impulse and that response there, it ends up popping up somewhere else in another part of your life. So that's displacement. Again, helps reduce anxiety. Reaction formation. Okay, this one is actually pretty straightforward. I refer to this one as the do the opposite defense mechanism. Our blocked desires in one context might get replaced in that same context by behavior that's the opposite of the original intent. Okay, so this is the do the opposite defense mechanism. So we love someone, but that love is not reciprocated. They don't respond in the same way. They don't basically love us back, if you will. And what happens is the love is transformed into its opposite. It's transformed into hate. Okay, this might make you think back to grade school. Little boys chasing little girls around. If one of the little boys really likes one of the little girls, he might tease her and try to pull her pigtails and so forth. Maybe that's a reaction formation through which he's trying to defend himself from thinking about that he actually likes that person, right? Or maybe you remember when your baby brother or baby sister was brought home from the hospital, and maybe you weren't real thrilled about this new person coming into your life and disrupting it to such a huge degree. So maybe you turned the hatred into love and you smothered the little one with affection, right? So that's the do the opposite. You don't want to say you don't like the baby, so what you do is you do the opposite of how you really feel, okay? That's what a reaction formation is going to be about. Again, aimed at reducing anxiety. Number 4 on the parade here, rationalization. This is where we come up with a reasonable sounding excuse. Reasonable sounding excuse / explanation, okay, for some kind of unacceptable behavior, right? We try to spin it, if you will. We're going to try to reinterpret this and spin it so that a negative behavior might be construed as, well, I can see why you did that, right? So if you say to your kids when you are beating them, in disciplining them, you're saying, I'm doing this for your own good. That's you spinning it in some way, right? If you really wanted to be able to get at these grapes, but like the fox in Aesop's fable, you couldn't reach those grapes, you might say that those grapes are sour, okay? If you're not studying for your test on Tuesday and your roommate says, don't you have a test? Why aren't you studying? You might say, well, last time I studied a whole lot and it didn't even make any kind of impact on my score on the test, so I'm not even going to do it this time. Okay, that's a reasonable sounding excuse or explanation where you're trying to explain away something that maybe would be an inappropriate or some kind of unacceptable behavior. Okay. 5th and final of these defense mechanisms, and then I'll stop to see if you guys have questions. It's called projection. One's own blocked desires become projected onto another person. Clearly, the woman on the right here is feeling jealous of the woman on the left, but she doesn't want to admit feeling jealous, so she's going to project those feelings of jealousy onto the woman on the left and say, she's actually feeling jealous of me. Okay? So jealousy of another person may lead one to believe that the other person is actually the jealous one. So with projection, it's a situation where you don't want to admit to yourself that you feel a certain way. You don't want to, quote unquote, own that feeling, right? In this case, what you don't want to own is the jealousy, right? There could be other feelings that you don't want to own or admit to, right? You really, really dislike your boss. If you turn that around and use projection, tell me in the chat box, what do you say? You don't say, I don't like my boss. You say instead, yeah, my boss doesn't like me, right? He or she has it in for me. I know they're trying to stick it to me, right? You really like somebody who lives in your dorm, but you don't want to admit that you like that person. What do you say? Instead of saying, I like him or her, what's the projection thing? I project those feelings onto them and say, they're the one that really likes me, right? Now, not that they hate me, but that they feel that way towards me, right? he made eye contact with me today. He must be absolutely in love with me, right? You're the person who's in love with him, but you don't want to admit that. You project, just like with the projective personality inventories, right? We're going to project those feelings onto this other person. All right? Any questions on those various defense mechanisms? These four here, or repression, which we snuck onto the previous slide there. If you have a question, just raise your hand. You'll pop to the top, and I'll be able to address whatever the confusion may be. All right, good. Let me grab my little polling question for you here. Try this one. I'll give you guys a minute to think your way through that. Alrighty, let's take a look at what you guys said for that one. Oh my goodness. It's rationalization. Why? Tell me in your own words in the chat box. Why did you go with rationalization for that one? Yeah, some kind of an excuse or an explanation, like, okay, I'm a cheapskate, but I'm going to say it's because I'm really trying to, help you become a mature, independent adult. An excuse or a reasonable sounding explanation. Awesome. That is really good to see. How about this one? Take a shot at that. I'll give you a minute or so to do that. I'll be right back. All right, let's do 10 more seconds here. All right, cool. Let's take a look at what you did with this one, and we'll discuss it. All right, most of you went with a reaction formation, that he's doing the opposite in some way. Okay, let's talk about that. That's the right answer. It is an example of reaction formation. How did you come up with that? What are the two opposite things going on? Crystal says he's doubtful, but he's acting the opposite. He's showing certainty. Yeah, I would say the key words here are he's got doubts, but he's expressing certainty. Okay, that's a clear example of reaction formation, that doing the opposite thing. Okay, it's not projection, right? Because he's not taking his feelings and saying someone else feels that way. It's not repression, because that would involve not thinking about it at all, be burying it. And displacement would be maybe concerns about what's going on in the religious context affecting something else in a different context. Okay? Questions on that one at all? Cool. Excellent. All right. So let's finish up this segment on Freud by talking about some of the limitations, some of the criticisms. There's difficulty in studying lots of his concepts under controlled laboratory conditions. Basically, this boils down to he's got a lot of stuff in his model that involves what we call unobservables. And those things really don't lend themselves well to scientific psychology, right, where we're trying to observe and measure things. His concepts are ambiguous and difficult to define and measure. There's also within his model lots of negativity, right, in all the sex and the aggression, all these impulses that really don't depict us in a very positive light. There's also with his model an emphasis on what we might call post hoc explanations. Those are explanations offered after the fact. It's like a Monday morning quarterbacking kind of thing. We're like, oh yeah, so here's what that's really all about, after the fact. What we like as scientists are theories that yield testable hypotheses and predictions about what will happen, and you offer those predictions on the front end. You don't offer explanations after you already know what has happened. So for a lot of different reasons, there were some pretty significant criticisms of Freud's model, and I'm going to focus in, as we transition into talking about humanistic theory of personality, on the negativity, right? Hang-ups in your childhood, sexual and aggressive impulses, this weird emphasis on childhood sexuality, which you'll read about in the book as you read about his psychosexual stages. Well, along come folks like Maslow and Rogers, I was trying to bounce back to this slide, who offer an alternative approach. And their humanistic theory paints a much more positive, hopeful, and optimistic picture of what makes people tick. Right, we're talking about personality. So why are people doing the things that they do? These guys say they're doing what they do because we're focused on free choice and self-determination, because we have growth potential. We have things that we're striving towards. So this is Maslow right here. He's this guy. Carl Rogers is this guy over here. And their model, again, is a philosophy almost that is much more positive and optimistic in its tone, right? They actually say that what people are striving towards within their lives is this thing that Maslow called self-actualization. So Maslow's big ideas include self-actualization down here and his hierarchy of needs that we'll look at on the next slide. When you're striving towards self-actualization, and this is a driver of personality, according to this humanistic theory, what you're striving towards is trying to be all you can be. Okay? You're trying to, in other words, maximize your potential in all the different roles that you play in your life. Okay? So Maslow would say when you are trying to self-actualize, you're trying to be the best student you can be, the best roommate you can be, the best brother or sister, boyfriend or girlfriend, co-worker, teammate, whatever the case might be, right? You're striving to maximize and do your very, very best, right? Think about how that's different from Freud, right? Freud had id with these aggressive and sexual impulses, and it had the superego fighting against that as the conscience saying, thou shalt not do all these different things. These guys want to look at where you're trying to go and what you're trying to do, right? What are you aiming towards? What are you striving for? And Maslow has this self-actualization goal as one of the major goals within his hierarchy of needs. And I want to make really just 2 points about his hierarchy of needs. Here's where self-actualization falls, by the way, striving to fulfill your potential. The 2 points I want to make about this hierarchy, and you don't need to memorize the different rungs in the hierarchy. The 2 points I want to make is that, number one, you move up the hierarchy as your lower needs are met. Okay, so number one, move up the hierarchy as lower needs are met. You also will move down the hierarchy if lower needs are unmet. Okay, so in other words, if you're working on self-actualization and a tornado blows through your town and destroys your house and your entire neighborhood, what you're going to do is stop worrying about being all you can be in all the different aspects of your life, and you're, I guess literally in that case, going to try to rebuild the foundation of your home, of your life, right? Food, water, and sleep are at the basic bottom of this hierarchy, okay? So we move our way up as we achieve these different rungs in our hierarchy of needs. And if something gets wobbly down below or is pulled out from underneath us, we'll revisit those more basic needs to make sure that that foundation is firm. Okay? So again, all this within the context of this humanistic theory has a much more positive, optimistic tone to it, doesn't it? It just feels really different from what we laid out in Freud's model, and that's on purpose, right? I said if you understand Freud, you'll understand why these other models emphasize the things they do. That's exactly what's going on here, right? Rogers and Maslow emphasize the things that they do because they have objections to the negative view of people that sort of results from the major ideas within Freud's model, okay? Any questions about these humanistic theory ideas? If you do this, click on that hand button up above the list of names, and it will tell me that I've got to clarify something for you. Yeah, Gabriel. Yeah, they work together. Yeah, Maslow and Rogers, sometimes explicitly, sometimes in parallel. And we're actually going to revisit Rogers when we talk about different approaches to treatment, because Rogers has an approach to treatment that's called client-centered or person-centered therapy that is very much in tune with this philosophy, this optimistic viewpoint of people with, again, that emphasis on the growth potential. Okay? Good. All right, let's go back to our checklist of personality theory. So we've taken care of Freud. We spent 20 minutes plus talking about him. Now we've talked about Maslow and Rogers. In the final 15 minutes here, I want to review Bandura's cognitive social learning theory model, and then finish up with the Big Five model, or the five-factor model. So not surprisingly, the model that we get from Albert Bandura, who, if you don't remember, is the guy who did the Bobo doll experiment that we talked about back in the section on learning. He offers us a model that emphasizes observational learning. So I want you to take home 3 points from his model. Number one, there's an emphasis on observational learning. That is, in terms of personality development, why you end up being the way that you are. Let me grab a drink for a second. I got something in my throat. He would say that you learn to be outgoing, or you learn to be shy, or you learn to be dependable, or maybe undependable, based on what you see within your family, within your network of friends, etc. So that's one factor. Second major factor in personality, according to Bandura's model, is reciprocal determinism. And I'm going to try to make this simple. Reciprocal determinism just refers to a situation where we have two-headed arrows. What do I mean by two-headed arrows? It means that there are reciprocal interactions between and among thoughts, environments, and behavior. Look at all the two-headed arrows over here. And the example they're running with, which is a little bit of a silly one here, is interest in rock climbing. That's your behavior, learning to rock climb. Well, that rock climbing behavior is going to have an impact on your environment in terms of who you spend your time with. And the fact that you're spending your time with these people that are all into this rock climbing probably makes it more likely that you're going to engage in that behavior. What else is reciprocal here? Well, the learning to rock climb behavior is going to maybe change your thoughts and feelings about all kinds of risky activities. Okay? You might be more willing to do other things that might be somewhat risky behaviors. And then as those thoughts change, that could impact your interest in rock climbing. So there is a richness to this where behaviors, environments, and things going on in our head are all influencing each other. Okay, that's the idea of reciprocal determinism, that not only is A affecting B, but B is also affecting A. Okay? The third and final idea from Bandura is going to hopefully remind you guys of a story that was probably read to you a bunch of time when you were kids. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay? It's called self-efficacy, and the definition is right here. Self-efficacy is the belief that you can perform adequately in a particular situation. It's the belief that you have what's necessary to do what's required of you in a given situation. And I think a key part of this definition is the in a particular situation. It's not a general, global, overall feeling about yourself. That's self-esteem, right? How you feel about yourself overall. Self-efficacy is much more specific. It's about your ability to do the things that are required of you, like on a checklist of behaviors to achieve some goal. Okay, so if your goal, let's say, is getting an A in history, okay, the situation here is, in terms of self-efficacy, this involves your beliefs in your ability to do A and B and whatever C might be, and then whatever D might be, okay? Do you think you have what it takes to do these different things that are required of you? Okay, that's the question. Would you say to yourself, yep, I can do that, I can do that, I got that, I got that as well. Yes. Okay, and the reason that matters is that the self-efficacy beliefs have a big impact on, number one, how much effort you put into it and how long you persist in the face of difficulties. So how hard you try and how long you persist in the face of adversity is a direct function of the degree to which you have these self-efficacy beliefs. Okay? So, what was the story in childhood that had to do with a character who was trying to do something and really believed that he could do it? And he kept saying to himself, I think I could do this. Yeah, the little engine that could. Everybody says it's Thomas the Tank Engine. It's not Thomas. It's the little engine that could, right? Because what does the little engine that could say to himself repeatedly as he's going up the mountain? I think I can. I think I can. Right? You could say that the little engine that could had high self-efficacy beliefs as it relates to achieving the goal of not getting an A in history, but in getting himself over the mountain. I've got all those things that are required to get there. Now I'm going to be able to do it. Okay? What does that mean? It means he tries really, really hard, and when the going gets tough, he doesn't give up. He persists. Okay? A big, big thing. I just love this construct. I think this is a really powerful variable that affects a lot of things that matter in an academic setting, in your life in general, right? How much of that stick-to-itiveness do you have? Probably a function of these self-efficacy beliefs. All right? Questions about these three things that Bandura emphasizes: observational learning, reciprocal determinism, and self-efficacy. I'll probably ask you a question on two of the three things here. All right? Cool. 8 minutes to take care of the final thing to check off today. We can check off Bandura. Now we're going to talk about Cattell's five-factor model, also known as the Big Five model of personality. What's the deal here? His five-factor model is what we would call an empirically derived model. What that means is it's a model that is derived from empirical observations of people. And the observations would come in the form of self-report responses. When Cattell puts together this model, he doesn't have some grand plan of, here's what I think are the 5 dimensions of personality. What he does is he boils down 4,500 trait words that he culled from an unabridged dictionary, words that could describe a person in terms of their personality: friendly, shy, guarded, paranoid, etc., right? These traits tended to group together into 16 different personality dimensions, and if you keep stirring the soup there, ultimately what you get is 5 factors here, the big 5 dimensions of personality. The way that he does this, by the way, is not by making soup. He used something called a factor analysis. We don't need to know anything about factor analysis, but basically it's a statistical procedure where you can take hundreds of items that people are answering and responding to and see what items cluster together in certain dimensions. He ultimately found 5 major clusters that become the big 5 factors of personality that are part of his model. Okay? So again, 4,500 down to 16, ultimately down to 5, which is good because we know we can hold 5 to 9 items in short-term memory. If it was the big 16 personality factor, we would be in big trouble, right? We wouldn't be able to hold on to these. The other really cool thing about the big 5 personality factors is they spell out the word ocean. This is our best mnemonic of the entire semester. So it's openness. I'm actually going to call that openness to experience. That's the O in ocean. It's conscientiousness, which I've been referring to a couple times this morning. Extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Let's go through each. Openness to experience. If you are low on this dimension, and the left side of each of these dimensions is where you would be if you scored low, you would be described If you're low in openness to experience as conforming, uncreative, practical, basically unwilling to try new things. If you are high on this dimension, you'd be described as unconforming, creative, imaginative, willing to try new stuff. Conscientiousness, dimension number 2. If you're low on conscientiousness, you're unreliable, lazy, spontaneous. If you're conscientious, you're reliable, ambitious, punctual. You show up for things on time. You turn things in on time, right? If you're coming back to the airport in San Diego and you have a friend scheduled to pick you up, you want the friend who's high on conscientiousness, right? And as you look at these different dimensions, if you have really good examples from TV shows or movies or maybe from people in your own life, as long as they're not going to see your notes, right? You have a low conscientiousness cousin. Write his or her name down right there. That may help you remember this and anchor this in memory. Extroversion, are you outgoing or not? If you're low on this dimension, you're introverted, not extroverted. You're a loner, you're quiet, you're reserved. If you're highly extroverted, you're sociable, you're talkative, you're affectionate. Agreeableness, how easy to get along with are you? Well, if you're highly agreeable, you're flexible, you're good-natured, you're trusting, you're helpful, you're not bitching and moaning about everything. If you're low on agreeableness, you're grouchy and crotchety and rude and uncooperative and critical, and you're constantly bitching and moaning about things. Okay, that's agreeableness. And then finally, neuroticism is an anxiety-proneness dimension, right? If you're highly neurotic, you're emotional, temperamental, worried, fretful all the time. I think about Woody Allen in any movie he's been in, right? He's highly neurotic. If you're low on the neuroticism scale, you're cool, calm, and collected, right? You want your quarterback in the final drive in the Super Bowl to be a guy who is low in neuroticism, right? Cool, calm, and collected. Take care of business and get things done and not be hampered by being worried and fretful in that situation, okay? So it spells ocean. If you like to play with jumbled letters, it could also spell the word canoe, which you could use on the ocean. So either way, ocean or canoe will help you remember the big 5 factors here. Questions on any of those? How about a final quick little polling question for you? And this one is actually going to have 5 answer choices because it's about the big 5 model here. A student in your class is very studious and hardworking. She's never late for class, and she always turns in assignments on time. Awesome. That's your favorite kind of student if you're a teacher. It's likely that she would score high on which of the following dimensions of the big 5 model personalities. She's going to score high on openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, or neuroticism. I'll give you guys another 20 seconds to think your way through that. All right, last 10 seconds here. All right, what did we get? We got almost everybody, 29 out of 31 saying that's high on conscientiousness. Yes, absolutely it is, right? Because somebody who's conscientious, reliable, ambitious, punctual, that's exactly what we're describing there in that question. Okay? Questions on that item at all? We can go back to our list of the major theories and say, yep, now we talked about the big 5 model as well. We can go back to our title slide and say, yep, we talked about all the theories of personality too. Okay? Final questions on anything from today or anything from part 3 of the course here as we get ready to do test number 3 on Tuesday. Don't forget to do the Learning Curve quizzes. You've got some due Sunday night and some due Monday night, I believe. It's in the calendar or on Launchpad, so check it out. If any questions come up in the meantime, you can email them to me. Highly recommend going to SI sessions in preparation for Tuesday. And then again, remember, we start at 9:30. If you show up later than 9:55, you've got a big problem. You're not going to be able to take the test. So it could be raining on Tuesday. Make sure you're there on time. Come in an hour early or something so you're not worried about being late for the test. All right? Anything else, guys? Cool. Thanks for your attention today. I'll see you guys on Tuesday. Don't forget to X out of here so that I can make the recording available to your classmates. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, I can get that slide, Gabriel. Yep. Hold on one sec.